Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters, and welcome to this week's live chat. Have you missed me? I've been gone for a couple weeks. It has been a crazy, busy, fun summer of traveling with the family, getting my oldest daughter, middle child, off to college. That was pretty crazy, and then just kind of settling in for a busy fall. I missed you all. I hope everybody's summer went well. I hope that your bobbins were always full and you had no problems with your machine. In this week's live chat, I'm going to talk a little bit about batting because that's one of those questions that people ask a lot when I travel or even when I do Zoom presentations. What kind of batting do I use? What kind should you use? And it's something that doesn't quite fit in so nicely into like a book or, a tutorial. So it's a great topic for today's live chat. I'm going to show you lots of slides and examples, and I have some batting pieces I'm going to hold and scrunch on the camera. Unfortunately, you can't, feel it like I can, but hopefully the tips that I give you will give you a little more confidence when picking out the batting for your quilts. I love how many years ago, somebody had the bright idea to put some fuzzy stuff in between fabric to make a quilted piece. And aren't we all glad for that? So whether you call it wadding, like they do in some countries, or batting, it's definitely the part that makes the quilt. I like to say the quilting makes the quilt, but that batting piece in between is what makes the quilt extra special. Now, when I share tips and suggestions, you have to know that this is just coming from my point of reference, my expertise, and I'm only the expert of my opinion. So please don't change what you're doing if you love what you've got going on. But I do have experience with lots of different kinds of battings, and I'm going to give you some pointers with that. If you're watching live right now, thank you so much. You can leave your questions in the comments. Jessica, my partner in crime, isn't here today. She is off celebrating her wedding anniversary, so it's just me in the studio. So I might not get to all the questions, but that's okay. You can leave them in the comments, and I'll get back to them next week. So anyway, when we're talking about batting, the most important thing, the number one rule, is that you want to use a quality batting. If you think about what that batting is doing, it's giving that quilt structure. It needs to hold up to the loving that it's going to get. I like to say you can save money in a lot of different areas, but I wouldn't do it with the batting. Some of my earlier quilts, I quilted with, that cheap polyester batting you can just look right through. And now, 20 years later, they're starting to beard through the quilt, which, is amusing to me when I can pull the little pieces out, but not great for the quilt. So as long as it's a quality batting, you're going to be good to go. By quality, I mean, does it feel nice? Is it, does it feel like something you would put on your bed? Is it from a reputable brand? Can you not see through it? That's all great things. But beyond that, there's so many different choices and options out there, and it can kind of be a little bit overwhelming. So let's demystify those a little bit. Let's talk about them, and then I have some examples to show you too. So let's talk about batting. Yeah, so really when people are thinking about what kind of batting, the first thing they're thinking is what material. That's the first kind of jumping off point because that kind of gets you to where you need to go next. So natural fibers would be one common material. Cotton would be the big one there. Wool or bamboo. So these are battings that are made from those natural fibers. These are great if you want that drape, you want that cuddly feeling to the quilt. You don't want it to be stiff, but you want to quilt a lot in it. So always a great option. I have an example I'm going to show you at the end of our little presentation. But when people ask me, oh, I'm quilting a quilt for my nephew or grandson or whatever, should I do less quilting so it'll be extra cuddly? And I'm kind of like, oh, quilt the heck out of that thing because it's going to help it last and hold up over the years. But if you use that natural fiber batting, you'll get that nice drape, that soft cuddly bit, that crinkly look, especially great if you're going to put it on your bed, you're going to use it, you're going to cuddle it, always a great option. So cotton, of course, the first biggie up there. Now, I just kind of did some poking around on YouTube, or not YouTube, on the internet. I kind of brought in some facts from different places. So very interesting what you can learn through a internet search. But cotton batting is kind of always in my mind is like one of the big two. It's cotton or polyester. That's usually the question, right? There's a lot of other options. We'll see that. But cotton is great because it's super comfortable. Think about a shirt, a cotton shirt, right? That good quality cotton is going to feel nice. But natural fibers do have a memory. so they're prone to creasing. You have to watch out for that too. So if you're making a quilt to travel with for trunk shows or something that's going to hang on a wall, maybe we don't want that memory to it. So something to keep in mind there. Some cotton battings will have seeds in them a little bit. Not usually. The better ones don't. And I had a piece. I got all my little scraps of batting together. So I found one little bit of cotton laying around. And you can see there, it just, has that nice texture. Feels nice. It doesn't feel stiff, doesn't feel gross. And that's usually a good option there. This is also a great option if you love that crinkly look when you wash your battings, because it tends to shrink just slightly. Even the great quality does, just a little bit. So it gives you that crinkly, nice look. Now beyond cotton, though, that's like the big one, but there's so many other different natural fibers that really playing around with the different options is pretty fun. First up is wool. So wool you might see a lot of when you see like show quilting or double batting. I have plenty of questions I'm going to address here at the end about that. Wool is great if I want that stitch definition. I want to see that pretty stitching. That is one of the drawbacks to the natural fibers. The definition of the quilting isn't quite the same as poly or the other battings. So if I want something in between, wool is going to be a nice option, and it kind of has that fluffy, puffy kind of look. I know you can't really see it, but it makes me feel like I'm doing my job holding it up to you. So wool is nice if you have like one of those large quilts and you want it to be warm, but you don't want it to be heavy. You don't want somebody to have to rescue you out from under your quilt at the next day. So that's always a nice option. And we're going to talk about layering battings, but this is a good option for layering there too. So just like cotton, just like any natural fiber, think about clothes, right? Wool socks are really nice and warm. So if you're prone to being really warm sleeper, maybe not the best quilt, but it's kind of a nice option to give you that definition with the natural fiber to it. Now another one that's a little bit different, bamboo batting. This one is I've never really even heard of it a few years ago, and it's really coming up because it's such a great eco-friendly choice. It's made out of bamboo, which is a quick growing plant, and it really feels nice, especially when it's blended with cotton or a specialty batting, which we'll see here in a second. So if you're wanting something that feels like cotton, but something's a little bit more eco-friendly, that's a nice option. But just like we've seen, with fabric, once you get into those specialty things, the price does tend to go up. And at the top of the price totem pole would be silk batting. Now, what I love about silk, it's naturally breathable. It has that great lightweight feel to it. It is so thin. It just nice and butter. So if you're using a quilt, like a question came up about making quilts with minky, this would be a great option. So if you want something light, that'd be a good one. Usually you see silk, sometimes you see 100% silk. I know that there's some different brands out there, but sometimes they're blended, like a bamboo silk blend. So there are blend options too, which we'll see here in a little bit. Now, besides the natural fibers, and we have synthetic fibers, which I really could just say polyester. And this is actually my batting of choice. So this right here, this is the batting I use on like 100% of the quilts that I do, and even at the shop. Now, I was convinced to carry cotton batting, but I love the poly. So what's the deal with that? Well, for some reason, when we hear poly, I tend to think of like scratchy shirts from the 70s. I tend to think of uncomfortable. It's not really the same thing. Think of more like it feels like felt, or it feels like really fuzzy fabric, but it just has a nice drape. So this is going to give me that definition with the quilting. It's going to give me that cuddliness to it, but doesn't have the memory like natural fiber does. So again, if I'm traveling with my quilts or I'm packing them up or folding them for long periods of time, those creases will be there. Again, I already talked about the bearding can happen with the cheaper battings. Really, you get what you pay for. It's really the best way to say about that. If it's too good to be true, chances are it's too good to be true. So polyester is my brand of choice. And when I started quilting for customers, I only had one little, room for all my quilting stuff. So I only had room for one roll of batting, and I just went with Quilter's Dream Poly Batting, which is what we see here. We'll talk about that here in a second. And so that's the only batting I used for so long because that's the only one I had room for. But there are so many different options out there, so many cool things that you can do with different battings. I want to talk real quickly about blends and specialties. So blends are really awesome because it lets you kind of pick and choose the benefits from each. Usually you'll hear that as like 80-20. You hear somebody say like, oh, I have 80-20 batting. Usually that means it's 80% cotton with 20% polyester. The idea being that we can get the best of both worlds. So I could have that soft, cuddly, cottony drape, but maybe the polyester will help prevent the creasing that can happen with natural fibers. So it can give you the best of both worlds, and especially if you want to try something like silk or specialty, you can kind of tiptoe into it. Again, as long as it's a quality batting and you love it, then go for it. And then of course, specialty battings, I didn't really put together too much on this, but you think about heat resistant, like if you're going to make a pot holder or an oven mitt, something like that. Obviously you could use regular batting, but this is going to help, prevent you from burning your fingers. Fusible batting. Now, when I'm asked the question, what batting do I use? It depends on what machine I'm working on. If I'm working on my sit-down machine, I like to use fusible batting instead of pins. And so that would be what I'm using there. And I want to say it's 80-20. It's a blend too. And then there's also like green batting, which is made from recycled bottles. There's also flame retardant batting, all sorts of things out there. So if you need it, chances are you can find it. Just know that you have to do a little digging around for it. Once you decide the type of material that you want, right? So whether you're like, I'm going to go for all around poly, or I'm a natural fiber purist, I want cotton, then you have to think about loft. So when I talk about loft, I'm just really talking about the thickness of the batting itself. So the higher the loft, the thicker the batting will be. This one that I use a lot, almost exclusively, Quilter's Dream Poly, it's the Select Loft. So Select is just the middle loft, and I just got the middle one, but you can see it's pretty thin still. So it's not going to give you a whole bunch of difference there. So if I want a comforter style quilt, I want it to be puffy, I want it to be just all those, crinkly, wrinkly goodness, then a higher loft is going to be awesome. One thing to keep in mind though, the higher the loft, the more unwieldy it can be to quilt with. So if you're working on a sit-down machine, just be ready for that. That higher loft can make it a little bit heavier to push through. Definitely worth it, but a little bit heavier for sure. And then it's also going to give the quilting more definition. When I'm filming or I'm quilting samples for the shop or for, online or what have you, I really want the quilting to show, especially if that's to support a class or video series. So I'm going to gravitate towards the loft that's going to give me a little bit more definition. But if you're like, I don't really want anybody seeing my quilting, I'm not feeling so great about this, then the lower loft would be a great option too. So again, just kind of letting you fine tune and find that perfect spot. It's kind of like Goldilocks's, porridge. All right, couple things to think about. So couple of things that come up in conversation, scrim. So you might hear the question, scrim up or scrim down. If it's a cotton batting, sometimes some battings will have a scrim to help hold it together. And so there's a clear right or wrong side to the batting. Now here is where I go out on a limb and I'm going to say I've never noticed a difference no matter which direction I put that. I'm kind of glad that at least there's a video in between us, because I know some people are like, no, scrim up, scrim down. I don't know. I never really noticed a problem. And you can leave a comment and tell me and argue with me if you want. That's totally fine. I've used it both ways. But not all cotton batting will have a scrim. So if you feel that texture, just refer to the manufacturer to see what they suggest. So definitely something to think about. And then color. Gosh, you're like, oh my gosh, all these decisions, all these possibilities, right? You might hear people talking about white batting, natural color batting, black batting. What is that about? So the idea being, if you have an all black quilt and you're using polyester, sometimes that white can beard through the fabric. And so some quilters will use a black batting or a color batting that matches their quilt top. I've also never really worried about that. Now, I should pause real quick and tell you that I'm not talking about show quilts. I'm just talking about quilts we have laying around. So I don't think I've ever used a black batting over the years. I've ordered some, but I don't think I've ever used them. Because if there's any white or any cream or any light on that quilt top, that black is going to show through. So just use it with care. Okay, so the big question, the million-dollar question always is multiple layers, right? So you probably, if you watch any of my live chats, you've heard me talk about on Tula's quilts, I love to put 2 layers of batting. What is that all about? Well, 2 layers of batting allows you to get even more definition with the quilting. And you can see this little picture snippet off to the side. This is just, it's a class sample, and I quilted it with 2 layers of batting to really let the quilting pop off of the quilt so you can see it. So this is going to be more for art quilts, quilts that hang on the wall, quilts that go to Quilt Market and hang in somebody's booth, that kind of thing. It's going to give it that stability and help it lay nice and flat. Now, when you're mixing up your battings, you can do whatever you want. So remember I said I only had room for one type of batting in my quilting room, so this is what I carried. So when I would start doing tulip quilts, I would just use 2 layers of it to give me more of that definition. Okay, there's better options for sure, but just know that, you know, adding an extra layer of batting is going to give you even more definition to your quilting. Couple of caveats about that though. It's going to be very heavy. So if you're quilting on a sewing machine, this is probably not something I would suggest for a big quilt. Again, because it's going to be heavy to quilt, it's going to be heavy to sleep under and all that. So just keep that in mind. On a long arm, it's no different than quilting a regular quilt. I just put the 2 layers of batting down and do the same way. Now, when it comes to picking out the types of batting, it depends on what you're going for, right? Like, oh, there's that depends word. If I'm quilting the quilt and I really want to get that faux trapunto, that fake trapunto look, well, trapunto is a technique of cutting away pieces of batting and layering up batting in specific places to give definition to the quilting. And I have a quilted example I'll show you towards the end. But if I want to do something like that, I might opt for a nice thin bottom, and I might put something puffier on top like wool, right? Or just do 2 layers of what you have. And so the question that came up on the type chat before we went live was, what about batting for trapunto? Poor Teresa, she had made her quilt cutaway. It's a very time-intensive process, and she's like, you can't even really tell. Well, 2 layers, and I think she said she did 80-20. So cotton does not offer a lot of definition already, and then 2 layers of it is kind of like just 1 layer of regular batting. So unfortunately, it's a lesson we have now learned. If I want to get that puff, I'm going to go with something a little bit puffier on top. You could do 2 cottons, that's totally fine, but usually I want that puff. So I should back up and say polyester, even though I love this, there's different styles and different kinds out there. Quilter's Dream makes Quilter's Dream Puff, which is a puffier loft poly. And so there's just a lot of different options out there. So know that you can layer your battings together. Just progress carefully throughout the quilt, and it's gonna be fine. No problems there. All right, other batting notes. So a couple of things, and then I'm gonna show you some pictures and show you some quilts. So once you've decided on that batting, you have found your happy place. You're like, I'm never switching batting again because this is just where I know where it's at. There's different ways to purchase. So you can buy it by the package, you can buy it by the roll if you can work that out. If you're using packaged battings such as cotton or that natural fiber, I would open it up a day or 2 before to let it ease and relax. Nobody wants to iron their batting, right? But if it's creased, sometimes you can have that kind of issue there. And just check with the manufacturer. When in doubt, they're going to tell you exactly what you need to do. So when people will ask me, oh, how dense, how far apart is too far to quilt? It depends on your batting. So if your batting says quilt every 10 inches, that means you have to have some quilting every 10 inches. So just check with the manufacturer and find that out. And then I just found this quick little breakdown of the different sizes that you can buy. So when I was looking at buying batting, I felt for me the best option was to get the queen size roll that's 30 yards. So that's what I would always carry. That's what my long arm owners use, and that's just a little bit more efficient. The reason I don't do king size is because I quilt very few king size quilts, and I don't want to have big chunks of batting left over. I'm going to tell you what you can do with that if that does happen. So I stick with the queen, which is that 93 or 108, whatever that is, and then if I need to, I can turn my quilt. So there's different options there. For instance, if somebody I knew really wanted, this one quilt, you want this one particular batting, get that. But I get it. It can be hard to decide. So try some different battings, and you'll quickly fall into love with the one that is your favorite. So a couple of things I want to show you, and then a couple questions to answer, and then I'll pop over to the YouTube channel and answer any questions I can. Okay, so this particular quilt, this is my example quilt. This quilt goes everywhere with me just for one question. Its whole existence for one question. when people ask me what kind of batting I use, or when people ask, should I quilt it less so that it's not so stiff? So this quilt is quilted to death. I wish you could feel it, but then I'd have to mail it to you, and I don't want to lose my quilt. It's quilted to death. That's some teeny tiny quilting, but it's still very soft, very drapey. It's never been washed. It just travels around with me. It's because it's that bamboo silk blend batting. Very thin loft, very light, very luscious, but look, not much definition on the quilting, which is fine, but dang it, if I'm quilting really small like that, I want the quilting to show up. So I had originally loaded a whole big piece of this batting because I wanted to quilt it. I got about this much done and realized I'm not getting that definition I want. So now it's my example. But see, there's that natural, that crease, that tendency to want to fold, or remember it's crease. And yes, I know you can roll it and you can refold it, but let's be honest here, that's not probably anything I'm gonna do. Another thing that I've used before for quilting is soft and stable. So it's basically made for bags. It's like headliner foam or auto foam. It's a very thin foam, but it gives stability to bags and stuff. And one time, Tula wanted me to quilt some fabric for her quilt market booth. She was going to cut up the fabric and turn it into a chair. And so she sent this with it. And I'm like, I don't know what to do with that. But let me tell you, it looks so good. The definition is so nice. So that's what I use for any of my panels. My wall hangings is all soft and stable. Again, I know it's hard to get an idea for the feel of it, but I just love how it helps it hang nice and flat and really gives definition to the quilting. I mean, even if you look just between, let's see if I can pull them both up without hitting my mic. So pretty crazy, huh? If you really want the quilting to stand out, you really want to be stiff and have some definition to it. For instance, it's going to go on a chair or it's going to be a wall hanging, then you might try soft and stable. Again, it's pretty thick, so on the sit-down machines, I'm not going to be using it for any big projects. And just another example, I know I showed this before in the thread painting, but this is, again, the soft and stable. I mean, this quilt could probably stand up on its own if I took long enough to get it. It's pretty stiff. So it's amazing to show that whatever you put in it, your batting is going to determine the outcome, right? So once you feel empowered and you're happy with your choices, then you'll be happy with the quilt itself. All right, so I did get on to type chat. I get on there about half an hour before we go live just to ask any questions, answer any questions I can, but if they're good on the night, or if they're applicable to the masses, let's say that. I wrote it down. So Gina said she is refurbing a comforter and wants a high loft batting like it used to have. She's thinking of sandwiching a poly batting in between two 80/20s. I love your ambitious spirit, Gina. That is going to be a lot of thickness. And once you get into 3 layers, it's like they start sliding around a little bit more. I think it's just going to be a pain to wrestle with. I think a great option if you're wanting that comforter look is to go with like puff batting. Quilter's Dream Puff has a higher loft, but it's poly, or just something that has a little bit more of a loft to it. That's just my opinion though. Of course, like I said, you can do whatever you want. And if you're like, I want all the heaviness because I want that quilt to hug me all night long, then that's great too. All right, so Teresa asked, what batting should we use for trapunto? Oh, I forgot, I have some pictures to show for that. One second, let me go back. So trapunto, and it's hard to explain just kind of in a quick example, but trapunto involves quilting your quilt, cutting away batting, and then quilting it again. And so not only are you quilting several elements twice, but you're cutting away the batting and you have to get the quilt wet to remove the water-soluble thread. If you're like, I have no idea what you're talking about, Walters, no worries. I did it exactly one time. I did it on the very first quilt I did for Tula, her cartwheels quilt, and I thought I'm going to do some trapunto. So all those scrolls are all done with trapunto. I had never trapuntoed anything before, and that was my last time. Trapunto is a really cool way to add definition to the quilting in particular areas, especially if you want, like that motif or something to draw out. But it is very time intensive. So I do what's more of a faux trapunto or a fake trapunto, where I just quilt the heck out of the area around the element and use 2 layers of batting, and that gives me that little standout bit without all the effort. Now the whole quilt is heavy instead of just parts of it, but again, you can kind of wrestle with that and see what works for you. But when it comes to batting with trapunto, something with loft, right? If you're going to take the time to cut out all those pieces and to finagle it, let's make it worth your effort. So wool is always a great option. That's a common one you'll hear, especially at shows. Quilter's Dream Puff, great option, or a slightly higher loft bit. It just depends really what effect you're going for. So hopefully that helps. Marion asked a great question. What about minky? When you're making a quilt with minky batting, that soft, luscious, soft, fleece, minky, anything like that, no problem. I use the same batting, my Quilter's Dream Poly Select, because that's what I had, but I would go with a lower loft batting. Now, again, this is a personal preference, right? This is totally up to you. But I know some quilters will say, well, I want it to be soft and cuddly. I'm not going to put any batting in it. I'm going to quilt it without the batting. I don't like to do that because I think the batting gives it stability. And it makes it easier to quilt. It'll mess up your tension. You'll have to mess with your tension if you take the batting out. But that's just me. So with minky, I would use a low loft cotton batting, especially because minky is all about the cuddle, right? We're not really hanging that on a wall. So the one thing to watch out with minky or fleece is just don't stretch it too tight and you'll be fine. All right, so Amy, Keto Quilters in the house. Great question, by the way. So she mentioned that where she lives, it's hard to get batting, it's expensive, and it's expensive everywhere because it's so unwieldy to ship, for sure. Any batting alternatives? Like what if you get, where you don't have any ability to get it, or what could you do? So there are some alternatives. It just depends on what you're going for. I know some quilters have put like a fleece blanket in between their quilts. A cheaper, smaller blanket, or even an older quilt, just sandwich it in there as a way to like repurpose that. Another thing you can do, and I wish I would have taken pictures of this, I'm gonna have to do this for you, probably for next week, splicing your batting. So remember I talked about how I just get the queen size roll and I make it fit? That's because I'm fine with splicing batting. So basically, if I have a quilt that's just too long, let's say the quilt, it's just too big for my queen batting, I could either order a king batting, or I could just use all the friggin' scraps I have laying around. And if you have sandwiched a few quilts, you have a few scraps laying around. So short story, and I'll take some pictures of this. I take my 2 layers right on my long arm. I overlap it. So this is the end of the old, this is the new, and I overlap them by a good 6 inches or so. And then carefully, so very carefully, cutting through only the battings, not the backing, I cut a serpentine line through both layers of the batting, just right there on my machine. Then what that's doing is making 2 sides that match each other. And so I pull off the small pieces from each side, and then it lays together nicely. The reason for the curve is so that you don't get this telltale folding spot where it, folds over on itself, and just kind of helps hide that splicing. I will splice in any quilt, right? I'll do it because I think it's fine. But if it's like towards the bottom, I might cheat it towards not exactly at the bottom or the middle. I kind of try to hide it. Or if the quilt has a lot of white fabric, you gotta beware because I don't want to see that splice. So just keep that in mind. So if you're running low on batting, I'm sure you could probably find a friend that has scraps they'll give to you, or you can work it that way. I know that some quilters like to put fusible tape on their spliced batting or sew it together, whatever makes you happy. I just do it right on my machine and just quilt it on down. So that's how I kind of handle it. Another option, now this is a your mileage may vary kind of thing, Amy, but some some batting companies will have seconds. So you can call, just give it a shot and ask, do they have any seconds? These are battings that are still great, but maybe there's a little lumpy. Maybe it's just not quite up for selling, but still good quality, and sometimes you can get it for cheaper. Or especially if you're doing something for a charity event, don't be afraid to ask batting companies or for that kind of scrap. So that helps you. Hopefully, I would love to see what other quilter options have. So you can leave that in the comments. Other batting alternatives. It'd be kind of fun to see what comes up. Okay, Marlene asked a great question. Do I recommend double wool batting for wall hangings? Sure. 2 layers of wool is going to give me even more puff, right? Even more definition. But there's a risk reward. There's like a returning, or I can't think of the word, but you get so thick, then it's too thick and it's hard to quilt. So try 2 layers, try a little section real quick, make sure that feels okay on your machine, and then sure, go for it, 2 layers of batting. I have done up to 3 layers of wool batting and it doesn't look any different than 2 layers. So you can learn from my experience there. So hopefully that helps. I wrote how to fix a quilt with quilting. I'm not sure what that question was. I don't know what that was about. But anyway, again, there's a lot of options on the market. There's a lot of different battings available. As long as it's quality and it feels good, it's going to be great. But if you're wanting to get a certain result from your quilting, whether that's hiding it away or showing it off, then it's really going to help with that. So I'm just kind of looking through to see if there's any questions. Leah said, yeah, just be sure it's all the same batting type. They draw all up with quilting a bit differently. Yes, so if you're splicing together, I'm not going to put together two different types of battings. And this is just weird, but I also will only splice once. I think if I have to splice more than once, it looks a little tacky. Now, that's not for my own quilts. My own quilts, I'll splice those things all the way. But if it's like for Tula or something. And if I'm doing a double layer quilt, I'll splice both pieces together. I will vary. I won't put them in the same spot, but I'll move it around. So, and then Roxanne says that, multi-stitch zigzag works great too. Diminishing return. Thank you, Evelyn. It's a diminishing return. I was like, big word. I knew it was something return. I didn't want to have to try to figure it out. So love it. They call it the Franken batting. Yep, where you're splicing it together. Karen, love my candor. First and last punto. Listen, sometimes you try something and it's great. Sometimes you try something and it is not great. So I know there's so many options out there. And if you're part of a group, a sewing group, a guild, I have a fun activity for you. Get with your other machine quilters and each of you quilt up a big section of a certain kind of batting. Then you can cut it into squares and share them with each other and see what each one feels like. Sometimes it's hard to get an idea of what that drape's actually going to look like. Or just rest assured, even if you don't get the exact result you wanted, you're still going to have that beautiful quilt and it's going to have that quality batting in there and it's going to be fine. So hopefully I've given you some things to think about. Hopefully haven't made it don't want to make it more daunting on picking it out, but just give you some practical stuff to move forward with that. Now I'm going to be back next Thursday with another live chat. I will break down the splicing batting bit and I'll find something else to talk about. And then I'm hoping the week after that I'll get to announce our next year's block of the month Build a Quilt. So that's kind of been the big thing coming down the pike. So that registration is going to open up. So I can't wait to share all of that with you, tell you about some upcoming events. I'm glad I had such a great time traveling this summer, but I'm glad to be home and doing these live chats every week. So I will see you next Thursday at 3 p.m. Central. If you if you cannot watch live, no problem. You can catch them at any time. Until next week, everybody, happy quilting.